In the late 90s into the early 2000s, something weird kind of happened. For some reason, adult animation started hitting its stride. Suddenly, from seemingly out of nowhere, animation aimed exclusively at adults was becoming more common. Animation targeted at adults certainly existed before that point, as Ralph Bakshi could attest to. Even the Flintstones were intended to be watched by the whole family at first, but for some reason, this is the period where adult animation crawled out from the underground and into the public consciousness. This was the era of Futurama, South Park, Clone High, Undergrads, and Beavis and Butthead, just to name a few. Now, I imagine there are actual studies on how and why this happened, but in terms of speculation, the most concrete theory I have is that after The Simpsons debuted on Foxx, all the network realized how many adults were willing to watch cartoons. So to capitalize, they started churning out content that fit a more mature mindset. With even channels known for other markets like MTV, which up to that point only really played music videos, getting in on it. There's also the possibility that it relates to the invasion of Japanese anime stateside in the 2000s, and since those shows had more mature content, networks felt they needed to compete. This leads us to the circumstances we have now where adult animation is commonplace. Now, the fact that many of these shows aren't really very good is a whole nother conversation. The thing is, like a lot of other times where culture shifts, there were a lot of growing pains in the process. Take, for example, the fact that 3 out of the 5 shows I just mentioned were cancelled after 1 year. The reason why this may have happened could very well be that networks understood that people wanted adult animation, but they weren't super clear on what it should look like. A lot of the time, they were just aping what was successful and trying to adapt what they already had to the format. For instance, the situation between South Park and The Simpsons. After South Park premiered and was used as the new hotness for objectionable material, Fox realized that at the time their animation flagship The Simpsons, which used to get moral guardians up in arms, now seemed tame in comparison. So they felt they needed to step it up to compete, leading to such moments as Homer getting violated by a panda bear, which doesn't even make sense, because as we all know, pandas don't work like that. The thing is, this level of uncertainty of what to do bred a lack of confidence in what they were putting out. If something wasn't an immediate runaway hit, they didn't want to keep it around. But as time has demonstrated, an actual metric ton of those shows ended up being sleeper hits, only receiving their just desserts in the present. This brings us to the subject of this video. Created in 1997 by 2 former executive producers of The Simpsons, Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein, coincidentally, they're the ones who wrote Who Shot Mr. Burns. But they also wrote The Principal and the Pauper, so clearly a mixed episode output. Premiering on the WB in 1999, Mission Hill can in a lot of ways serve as a case study of the absurdity of a show being influential with far-reaching consequences, but also completely flying under the radar of a general populace until it was far too late. The primary viewpoint character is Andy French, a 24-year-old aspiring cartoonist. He lives with his roommates Posey and Brian in the fictional neighborhood of Mission Hill in the even more fictional city of Cosmopolis. At the start of the series, he's forced to take in his pill of a little brother, Kevin, along with the family dog Stogie, due to the parents leaving for Wyoming. The series follows the quartets and their neighbors' various misadventures in the city. Yeah, kind of. So, along with the main 4, there were of course their aforementioned friends and neighbors. First is the young parent Natalie and Carlos. Carlos is a stay-at-home dad/artist, and Natalie's a professor of women's studies at the local university, along with their baby, Nameless, who shall remain nameless until such time as they have picked out a suitable name that doesn't impose gender norms. So, of course, pretty progressive-minded people. There's also the only central character who doesn't live in their building, Andy's on-again, off-again girlfriend, Gwen, voiced by Jane Wiedland of the band The Go-Go's. Apparently, when the pilot was first recorded, Jane, fresh from a visit to a dentist, was still loopy off the dental anesthetic, which also made her voice sound kind of breathy.
That jerk. He's always doing this to us.
Afterwards, she just kept doing the voice that way. There's also Kevin's friends, Toby and George. They're dorks. They're voiced by Josh and Bill. George is probably going to need recast. And finally, the elderly Gus and Wally. Wally's the projectionist of the local revivalist cinema and owned a local diner with Gus, who cooks the food and manages. There's one other thing about them, though. What was that? Yeah. They're 2 gay men in their 60s on a 90s TV show. And they weren't exactly dancing on the censors on this show. More like on top of the censor's grave.
Either argue or have gay sex, and then it's off to work.
But more importantly, Gus and Wally are characters.
Wally, doesn't Jim look gay in those pants? Nah, no self-respecting gay man would be caught dead in them trunks.
Remember, at the time, the only gay characters on TV were few, young, and over the top. Around that time, the only other real attempt at a three-dimensional gay main character was from Ellen, the sitcom Ellen DeGeneres starred in, and that got cancelled near immediately after Ellen came out of the closet, making Gus and Wally both subversions, both because of their older age and general sedate personalities. Primarily because they're not as young as they used to be. And you do get the real sense that these two have been in a relationship for a very long time, at least enough to feel like they can be completely honest with each other. It's even made clear they're capable of having fights, but it usually comes from a place of concern. True love is seeing a knife in your partner's head and wanting to do something about it, so of course you try to teach them a lesson by attaching more stuff. But don't you worry, this was still the 90s. The show brought some nerd stereotypes with them to even the scales.
I'm a big fan of your work.
Oh, that's sweet.
Honestly, looking back on the show, a fair amount of it was a product of its time. Like, Toby here. In one episode, his tiny subplot can only work because he's unable to call his mom for help, because the only reliable way to do that was with a payphone. And it kind of had to be that way. It was a satire on city life and the youth culture in the late 90s. For example, an entire episode's plot predicated on the fact that because the show The Real World was having a season in Mission Hill, the occupants feared that the attention would attract yuppies and drive up the rent, which is obviously outdated by both the fact that the real world doesn't exist anymore due to being supplanted by reality shows that tend to focus on a singular cast, a la the Jersey Shore, for example, but also that if yuppies existed today, they would not be able to afford any of these houses. Another example was the episode about how often the media blows things way out of proportion in the face of a so-called crisis for the sake of attention, which, after 9/11 jump-started the war on terror, if you dared to criticize the news for maybe exaggerating and fear-mongering to get good ratings, it would have been considered high treason. There's one other solid reason, but it's going to require setting up first. But while we're still here, something that's still very much topical is a plot point in the episode about Kevin trying to improve his SAT scores. It's explained early on that all the Ivy League schools don't just want good grades, but are also starting to want extracurriculars, which is still very much a thing. Anyway, by now you may have noticed the show's distinct art style. Mission Hill happened to have been one of the last series ever made using hand-painted cell animation. Due to the show's saturated neon-bright art style, it would be impossible to replicate it digitally. The producers even claimed the transition from cell to the screen had some loss of color already. They also decided to incorporate cartoon-esque effects into the show, kind of making it operate like a classic Warner Brothers cartoon that only starred humans. Now, this is a weird thing. Mission Hill's episodes have two names. One normal and one not safe for work. For example, there's the episode where Andy goes to Kevin's school for parent-teacher night to talk to his teachers and meet Kevin's friends' parents.
Hey, I know you. Malt liquor box of bugles.
I know you too. No credit, pay now.
It's called Andy Joins the PTA, but it has another title, Great Sexpectations. Or, to name another, the episode Andy vs. the Real World is also named the Big-Ass Viacom Lawsuit. It may have also not escaped your attention that despite being a fictional location, Mission Hill is an unusually detailed setting. The city of Cosmopolis itself takes a fair amount of cues from both New York and Chicago. The neighborhood itself is actually an amalgamation of a fair amount of real-life neighborhoods. To be more specific, Williamsburg, Brooklyn, Silver Lake in Los Angeles, Mission Hill in Boston, and the Mission District of San Francisco, giving the city this really interesting liminal state of looking like both an East Coast and a West Coast city. Though in regards to its fictional setting, they sincerely bothered to make Cosmopolis' identity as a distinct location. If the internet is to be believed, a pretty large amount of development time was no joke dedicated by both the writers and artists to designing fictional advertisements, bands, food, and even a bus schedule in addition to traffic. This means a bunch of writers and animators probably put more time, thought, money, and effort in the creation of a reliable public transit system for a fictional neighborhood than most leaders of major American cities. The show even dips its toe into a continuous plot line. In this context, they give an arc to Andy's employment. At the beginning of the series, Andy is sending out his work to newspapers and other outlets, with, let's say, sometimes concerning results.
I love the stink lines. Do you draw minorities?
To make ends meet, he works a slightly above average minimum wage job at a waterbed store, which had distinct advantages, only for the rug to get pulled out from under him once revealed his boss Ron had been committing massive tax fraud, forcing the store to close. From there, Andy is forced to try and re-find work, with the episode and the one afterwards dedicated to it. I'd now like to take a detour for a second and explain something. There's a trope that presents itself in sitcoms called Friends Rent Control. It's basically the shorthand way of pointing out how often large apartments in major cities like New York were used in fiction, despite it being extremely strange that the characters could afford them. The reason I explain this to you is that unlike a lot of other media at the time, there's an actual quantifiable explanation for how the Mission Hill gang can afford their massive 4-bedroom, 2-floor apartment, despite the fact that only 2 of the 4 roommates have jobs, with Kevin being a student, and Posey having her occasional forays into self-employment, often being scuttled by mishaps, specifically the massage incident.
Let Posey's soft hands give you healing relief.
That says release.
For one thing, it's supposed to be a refurbished industrial building, and because it's still considered off people's radar, the rent stays low. That's why when the real world came in, there was so much concern about them exposing Mission Hill. If people knew how great it was, they all started flocking there, causing the rent to rise. That is until I assume they meet the Republican vampire.
I follow Marilyn Manson, but I obey Rush Limbaugh.
A blood-sucking parasite that's also a vampire? No dice. And the second is Jim's job. See, up until the episode after Andy lost his, despite being best friends since high school, Andy has no idea what Jim does for a living. Most likely because Jim rarely goes to work, and based on Jim's behavior... Which doesn't exactly scream brings home the bacon. Now, Andy knows Jim has a job. There's a whole subplot in one episode about how Jim brought back some futuristic hot pants, which he got during what he claimed to be a business trip. But he doesn't know the specifics. That is until Jim's job status intertwines with Andy's unemployment. After Andy loses a tooth, Jim lends him his insurance card so he can pretend to be him at the dentist, and not knowing what Jim does isn't able to fill out the form.
Jim works at an advertising agency.
No, not like that. He mainly worked with the art department. As it turns out, Jim's job is the final example of how steeped in the culture of the late 90s the show was. In this case, it's that despite being a space cadet, Jim happens to be computer literate at a time when most executives were not. Jim's job at the ad agency hinges on the fact that as the resident young person that knows basic computing, he can coast by secure in the fact that even being able to use one period blows their minds.
It's like, whoa, high-res Photoshop batch compositing blows my mind. Let's have Jim handle it.
Giving him massive amounts of cachet in terms of the company. How much, you may ask? See, after convincing Andy to apply for an opening in the art department, and after the interviewer doesn't pick him, Jim gets the boss of the company to not only get the guy they hired instead of Andy fired, but even the guy who didn't hire Andy too. But this is inherently a fictional setting. Not because of this, though. It's a work of fiction because Andy's new health insurance actually covered his dental work. Or am I wrong for saying insurance companies shouldn't jerk their clients around?
The law requires that I answer no.
I'm also a big fan of the episode where they mock nightclub culture. Okay, so, after not being allowed into a nightclub, Andy, Jim, and Posey come up with an idea. What if they made their very own nightclub, and better yet, only let people they like in? But all they can get is the meter room. Quite literally, their building's meter room. Then they get an even better idea. When they were standing outside to try and figure out what to do with it, a line formed behind them, assuming the meter room is an actual club. And by the laws of artificial scarcity, wherein the more you prevent someone from getting something, the more they start wanting it, the line gets bigger. The trio, taking advantage, starts messing with the people in line by keeping them out, leaving them unaware that they're standing outside of a room the size of a closet, even hoodwinking the guy who wouldn't let them into his club, ironically making them want to go to a real club again, culminating in fake blowing up the club so they don't have to keep the ruse up any longer.
This is insanity!
Everything gone! Gone in the blink of an eye!
And it works so well, a bunch of posers in the line start making up details of how great it was in there. Now at this point, you're probably asking yourself, what about Kevin? He's one of the main characters, and I've barely said anything substantial about him. Well, I mean, all things considered, Kevin's a pretty simple character. He starts the series by moving to Mission Hill and makes friends with George and Toby. Most of his plots revolve around being a nerdy teenager in the big city. There's the previously mentioned SAT episode, one where he gets paranoid over Toby getting revenge on him via an online game. He even drags Andy to a comic convention. The only standouts, I suppose, are when an episode deals with Kevin ironically not thinking things through. Like Andy's previously mentioned old boss, Ron, entrusting him to look after his car while in jail. Wherein, Kevin ends up blowing all the money he has paying for gas. Because Ron's car doesn't take gasoline. It takes race car fuel.
A piece of advice, son. You gonna pay these prices, you really should get you some sponsorship.
Even worse, the money he chose to use wasn't his. It was from Andy's unemployment check. Also, choosing a car insurance he only had to pay $19 for. So, when it falls off a bridge, he only gets $400 back on a car that's presumably worth tens of thousands of dollars. Though there happens to be one thing that makes Kevin interesting. He's a harsh deconstruction of what a straight-A student with little to no social skills would actually behave like. See, Kevin's the perfect fusion of really coddled and also scummy. See, unlike Andy, who their parents don't seem to like all that much, Kevin was constantly looked after and rewarded, so much that he just assumed Andy would continue doing it. This, of course, gives him a massive culture shock when Andy's not interested in treating him that way.
Mom and Dad said you're supposed to do everything they normally do.
Okay, well, why don't you go hop into bed, and I'll be in a moment to sprinkle talcum powder on your ass.
It's also insinuated that no adult, barring his parents, who has to spend any length of time with him, truly likes him. His new teachers being a prime example.
I'm concerned, Mr. Zelansky.
Yeah, you would be.
Presumably because he acts like a little narc. There is a scene in which Kevin, after going through Andy's closet, finds a taped-up box, and without permission from Andy, instead calls their parents for permission to open it. Kevin suffers from the greatest blight on a brilliant mind, thinking he can do no wrong. This attitude makes him do things that he mentally justifies as right, which from an outside perspective seems pretty shady. For example, thinking it would be smart to cheat on the SATs by enlisting a jock to help him procure old tests that he can feed into his computer, which the jock does, by stealing them. Only having regrets when the idea that people Kevin considers undesirables would benefit. Also, earlier in the pursuit of a way to crack the system, he set his friend's computers on fire. Needless to say, despite having the collective upper body strength of an anemic with a vitamin C deficiency, they beat the crap out of him. Then, of course, there's the time he dated an unpopular girl nicknamed Weirdy, so her elderly scientist father would write him a letter of recommendation, not even stopping when the man dies. He doesn't even actually face consequences for it, seeing as how the girl was dating him to make her dad happy. She even helps him steal the letter from a top-secret military base, which is a felony at best and an invitation to get shot at worst. And that's not even getting into the time he caused a convenience store fire. Unsurprisingly, due to his stories being so bananas, he spends a healthy amount of time as this A story. In a way, Kevin's story parallels the first baby steps of adulthood. It's only really after accepting how different things are, and realizing that it can never be that simple again, is when Kevin starts becoming a better person.
Nothing out here's as good as I remember. Not even home.
Well, you've got a new home now anyway.
Maybe you're right.
Even getting a new hobby. Before I tell you that story, I need to tell you another. Do you remember how I said that Mission Hill happens to have had far-reaching consequences? Well, besides Gus and Wally's characters aging like fine wine, there's an even stranger one. During its very short run, Tom Kenny, the voice actor many of you would know from such roles as Ice King and Spongebob, was also Wally's voice actor. But, while on the show, he also happened to voice a myriad of other parts.
For Clearasil, I'm Panzer, your student network EJ.
Come on, Andy. Everybody's got some deep hidden pain. Share with us.
You out of gas, fool.
This isn't a very strange thing. A lot of shows will use one actor for multiple parts. Seth MacFarlane of Family Guy voices 3 out of the 6 main characters, and a whole bunch of other characters around Quahog. But one of the other roles Tom played is the fictional actor Jimmy Briskin. See, Briskin's deal is that he was one of the little people who played an Ewok in Star Wars Return of the Jedi. The reason he's important is the voice that Tom chose for him.
I'm Jimmy Briskin. You might know me better as Ewok Villager number 2 from the hit film Return of the Jedi.
Let me make it just a little bit easier.
Could I interest you in some lessons? Only 25 cents.
The first version of the voice that we associate with SpongeBob was in Mission Hill, and we all know how explosively popular that got. It's actually funny that that's where the voice originally popped up, seeing as how Tom has been incredibly candid in the past about the voice starting as an impersonation of a P.O. little person who couldn't find work outside of being a Christmas elf. Now, let's return to Kevin. The reason is that the last episode ever fully made happens to have been a Kevin and Wally-centric episode. So in this episode, Plan 9 from Mission Hill, Kevin discovers the magic of the X rating.
That naked chick's on there, man. You go click, 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 click. It's real easy, man.
No, I'm talking about the original X rating. The X rating was originally for movies to denote their extreme adult content. It was the rating above rated R, which allows someone under 17 to see it provided they have adult permission. The X rating adamantly requires that you be 17 or over, no exceptions. This of course presented a problem for cinemas. Due to the presumed smaller turnout, and the emphasis on more potentially polarizing adult content, theaters were a lot less likely to show X-rated movies. To compensate for that, typically what would often happen is if a movie got an X rating, it would get re-edited and knock it down to a lower age rating, a practice that a lot of movies still do. Things changed though in the 70s. During that time, the adult entertainment industry realized the X rating wasn't trademarked. So they took advantage of the situation to start slapping it to their, movies. After that, to distance themselves from the rating's newfound infamy, and to avoid confusion, the MPAA changed what was once the X rating to NC-17. Now, despite the inherent stigma of the X rating, many works of acclaimed cinema had at one time an X rating, before they were inevitably reassessed based on more modern sensibilities. A Clockwork Orange had an X rating, The Evil Dead had an NC-17 rating, and in the case of this episode, Kevin thought he was about to see an X-rated adult movie, only for it to turn out that what he had inadvertently paid for was to see Midnight Cowboy, the first and only X-rated movie to ever win the Academy Award for Best Picture. And after seeing Wally there, Kevin, with Wally's expertise in the moving picture, starts getting into the cinema, becoming closer not just as neighbors, but as friends. I dare say they're as close as
an elderly gay man and a straight teenage boy can be.
Things only hit a snag in their relationship when a certain movie that was thought to be lost to time is slated for a showing. As it turns out, Gus starred in a movie with a director by the name of Walter L. Ford, i.e. Wally Langford. Problem is, Wally doesn't want to talk about it. Kevin assumes that since Wally is so knowledgeable about movies, it must be quite good, and Wally's just being shy. So, assuming that, he opts to blanket Mission Hill in ads promoting the screening, leading to a packed house. And then the movie starts.
I am here at last.
Is this movie insane, or is it me?
Maybe somebody put drugs in our popcorn.
Well, just this is as good a time as any to explain that this episode is in reality a reference to the infamous director Ed Wood. If you've never seen the Tim Burton movie about him, Ed Wood is considered to have directed some of the worst movies ever made, primarily because of a combination of campy aesthetics, clear technical errors, slapdash special effects, and complete lack of any context for stock footage. He languished in obscurity until receiving a Golden Turkey for Worst Director of All Time in 1980, being received 2 years after his death in 1978 due to a combination of alcoholism and a heart attack. Nowadays, his movies are known for being so bad they're good again type films. Ed himself has even found a renewed status as an icon of the LGBTQ community due to his open cross-dressing, though it should be pointed out that he allegedly mostly derived maternal comfort from it and claimed he never had a gay experience in his life, with his friends even claiming him to be a frequent womanizer. But, like Wally, Ed was noted as a massive cinema fan too, and because it has now come out to the whole city that Wally produced such a bad movie, because of the sheer embarrassment, Wally refuses to speak to Kevin ever again, leaving it up to Andy to try and get to the bottom of how this could have possibly happened. So, in 1958, when Wally was in his, his 20s, after working as a cinematographer, his agent helped him get enlisted to make a movie for Warner Brothers. The subject could be anything he wanted, as long as he cast the upcoming stars Charlton Hestonopoulos and Paul McNewman.
Hestopolis, McNewman, those aren't exactly movie star names. Don't like the names? We'll change them, you got it.
With Wally's original vision being a science fiction allegory for Cold War politics, i.e. the day the Earth stood still with its serial numbers filed off. Things only hit a snag when he locked eyes with one of the stagehands, Gus. And that's when their relationship started. Unfortunately, this new development threw a wrench into production when Wally, thinking not with his brain, but with his heart, and probably also an objectively less glamorous part of his anatomy, elected to recast the lead, played by Paul Newman, with Gus.
Oh, come on. Whatever that guy did to get that part, I can do better. See ya.
And with Gus's complete inability to act, Heston stormed off the picture as well. So now, without any of the studio's money due to losing both of their requested actors, Wally, instead of just calling it quits and going back to his original job, makes another misstep and chooses to double down, forcing them to use a discount studio and to change the plot to accommodate their lack of a budget and Gus's perma-scowl. Suffice to say, afterwards, Wally's agent walked out on him too. So they took whatever money they had left and pulled it into the diner to open it. So Kevin, trying to mend bridges, tries to tell Wally that despite the audience's reactions, people are still enjoying the movie, in this case enjoying how bad it is. So with Kevin's encouragement, Wally goes back to Gus with a new perspective on their movie. Shame they never got to this episode in the original run, huh? Mission Hill only got 2 episodes in before they were put on hiatus. It only got to this episode after other networks rebroadcast it. I guess now it's time to talk about why the show got cancelled. The show happens to have the dubious honor of being one of the many shows that got cancelled before all their episodes could be made. Of the 18 episodes planned and scripted, only 13 have been officially released, with the other 5 only in rudimentary script form, and of those 5, only 2 in the form of voice storyboards. With only one of those, being a whole episode's length. Now, you may be asking yourself why this happened. It's fair to say that this started when it was first pitched.
Come on, I'm not MTV material. Hell, I'm barely WB material.
Mission Hill was actually first pitched to MTV, the home for a lot of experimental adult animation at the time. But MTV passed due to already having Daria and the then upcoming show Downtown, which, due to their similar names at the time, Mission Hill under the name of Downtowners, and with similar content, they felt it necessary to have both. After getting picked up by the WB is where things get odd. A year before the show premiered, the WB told them that during their upfronts period, the early period of a show's pre-production where advertisers can buy airtime, they were told that it didn't matter what their promos looked like. So they produced a crummy 2-minute clip, and with those being journalists and the general populace's only point of reference, started the show off on a sour note right off the jump. Further compounding the issue is why that was the only footage that they had seen. For some reason, the WB had failed to advertise the show for 7 months before the show premiered. But wait!
It gets worse!
The WB had actually scheduled it for the Friday night death slot of 8 p.m. Quite literally the exact time that its target audience would be trying their hardest to not be at home watching the WB. Somehow even worse, the show's time slot put it directly before a black sitcom block. And I don't mean like 2 episodes of the Wayans Brothers. I mean For Your Love, the Jamie Foxx Show, and the Steve Harvey Show. And, not to get stereotypical, but I think that target audience would probably be willing to wait a year for the show Girlfriends to premiere instead. The argument could also be made that since this was right smack dab in the middle of the WB's transition to an emphasis on live-action teenage girl fodder, your Charmed, your Buffys, a year later Felicity, Dawson's Creek, and of course Sabrina the Teenage Witch, they weren't exactly primed to give it a lot of attention in general. In hindsight, though, this does actually explain how their merging with UPN created the CW, giving us such nuggets of masterful dialogue as this.
I dropped out in the 4th grade to run drugs to support my nana.
On the plus side, though, in regard to the Mission Hill front, there have been discussions of a spin-off centering on Gus and Wally, and that's certainly not the worst idea in the world. There has been a larger focus on healthy depictions of non-hetero relationships being portrayed in animation, and most people who know about Mission Hill know about it because of hearing about Gus and Wally. So, I don't know, maybe it's time for Gus and Wally to show them how it's done.